A routine turned menacing. It was a damp autumn night, the kind where the cold seeped through layers of clothing, making even the briefest exposure to the air uncomfortable. The rain fell steadily, not hard enough to be a downpour, but enough to blur streetlights and create slick reflections on the asphalt. Carter Thompson, a diligent community worker in his late 40s, was on his way home from an exhausting day. His thoughts wandered as he drove, the soft hum of his car blending with the patter of rain against the windshield. He had spent the evening volunteering at a local youth center, a cause close to his heart. Tonight, though, he craved nothing more than a hot shower and a warm bed. As he turned onto the quiet suburban road leading to his neighborhood, the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted him from his thoughts. His pulse quickened, a reaction he had trained himself to suppress but could never entirely control. Carter's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching instinctively. He glanced at the mirror and saw the patrol car closing in, its siren momentarily wailing before being cut off. With a practiced calm, Carter activated his turn signal and pulled over, coming to a halt at the side of the road. The rhythmic blinking of his indicator mirrored the anxious beat of his heart. He turned off the engine, placed his hands firmly on the steering wheel, and waited. Carter had been here before, too many times to count. Despite being a law-abiding citizen, his skin color often made him a target. He had learned the hard way that in situations like this, any sign of defiance could be misconstrued as aggression. Stay calm, stay still, stay alive. It was a mantra etched into his mind after years of navigating a world that didn't always see him as equal. The patrol car came to a stop behind him, its headlights illuminating the interior of Carter's vehicle. The rain distorted the figure of the officer as he emerged, but Carter recognized the swagger instantly. Officer Gerald Blake. The man was notorious in the community, a name that inspired dread among many who had the misfortune of crossing his path. Blake was the kind of officer who believed the badge made him untouchable, his arrogance matched only by his blatant disregard for the rights of those he swore to protect. Carter took a deep breath as Blake approached, his tall frame and imposing demeanor exaggerated by the rain-soaked uniform. Blake tapped on the window with the knuckle of his gloved hand, the sound sharp and deliberate. Carter rolled down the window just enough to speak, keeping his hands visible. "License and registration," Blake said curtly, his voice devoid of pleasantries. His eyes scanned Carter with a mix of suspicion and disdain, as if searching for an excuse to escalate the situation. "Good evening, officer," Carter replied, his tone measured. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Blake smirked, a slow, condescending curve of his lips. "You were driving too slow. What are you hiding in there?" Carter blinked, momentarily stunned by the absurdity of the accusation. "It's raining," he said calmly. "I was being cautious." Blake's smirk vanished, replaced by a steely glare. "Step out of the car," he barked. Carter hesitated. "Officer, I don't understand." "I said step out of the car." Blake's voice rose, cutting through the rain like a whip. Carter unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, the cool rain stinging his skin as he stepped onto the slick pavement. He stood by the car, his posture neutral, his hands visible at his sides. Blake circled him slowly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness and lingering on Carter's face. "Open the trunk," Blake ordered. Carter frowned. "Officer, with all due respect, do you have a warrant?" Blake's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Do I look like I need a warrant? Open it, or I'll do it myself." Carter's mind raced. He knew his rights, knew that Blake was overstepping his authority, but he also knew how easily situations like this could spiral out of control. He weighed his options, his heart pounding. "Officer, I'm not refusing," he said carefully. "But you need legal cause to search my vehicle." Blake took a step closer, his face inches from Carter's. "Cause? You're the cause, pal," he sneered. "Now open it, or you're coming with me." Carter clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm not resisting," he said quietly. "But I know my rights." Blake chuckled darkly. "Your rights? Out here, your rights are what I say they are." Without warning, Blake strode to the rear of the car and yanked at the trunk. When he realized it was locked, he turned back to Carter, his expression a mix of annoyance and triumph. "Keys. Now." Carter hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed over the keys. The sound of the trunk popping open was jarring, like the crack of a starting gun in a race Carter didn't want to run. Blake lifted the trunk lid and swept his flashlight over the contents. There wasn't much to see. Some tools, a first aid kit, a neatly folded jacket. But then the beam landed on a sleek black briefcase, its surface gleaming under the light. Blake's smirk returned. "Well, well," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What do we have here?" Carter's stomach churned. "That's private," he said firmly. "You have no right." Blake ignored him, his hands already on the briefcase. He placed it on the edge of the trunk and flipped open the latches. Carter took a step forward, but Blake shot him a warning look. "Stay right there," Blake said, his voice low and dangerous. The briefcase opened with a soft click, revealing a neatly organized collection of files. Blake's flashlight moved over them, illuminating page after page of typed documents, each bearing official seals and signatures. In the center of the briefcase sat a small USB drive, its sleek design contrasting sharply with the otherwise mundane contents. Blake picked up one of the files and began to read. As his eyes scanned the document, the smirk on his face faded, his brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. He flipped through several more pages, his movements growing increasingly frantic. The confidence he had exuded moments ago was evaporating, replaced by something Carter had never seen in the officer before. Fear. What is this?" Blake muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Carter stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "It's the truth," he said simply. Blake looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and panic. He slammed the briefcase shut, as if trying to erase what he had just seen. But Carter knew it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The web of power. The rain had picked up slightly, a steady patter echoing around the isolated roadside. The dim glow of Blake's flashlight wavered as the officer struggled to keep his composure. His hand lingered on the locked briefcase, his mind reeling from what he had seen. The weight of the documents inside was far heavier than their physical mass. They were damning. A trail of truths capable of dismantling not just Blake's career, but the network of corruption that had nurtured his arrogance for years. Blake's breath quickened as he glared at Carter, who stood a few feet away, drenched but unyielding. The power dynamic between them had shifted imperceptibly, the invisible chain of authority Blake had wielded now trembling under the strain of exposure. "What is this?" Blake barked, his voice louder than necessary, as if volume could mask his growing fear. "Where did you get this?" Carter didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, piercing through Blake's bravado. "You already know what it is," he replied calmly. "You've seen enough to recognize the truth." Blake's fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can just walk around with this?" He spat, gesturing to the briefcase. "Who are you working with? What's your angle?" Carter took a step closer, the rain cascading off his jacket. "I don't have an angle, officer," he said, his voice firm but measured. "That's the difference between us. I don't play games with people's lives." Blake's face twisted in anger, but his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. He had spent years operating with impunity, shielded by a system that rewarded loyalty to corruption over justice. And now, in the middle of a quiet suburban road, his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "Do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into?" Blake hissed, his voice low and threatening. "This doesn't just involve me. The people connected to this, they don't play nice." Carter crossed his arms, unfazed by the warning. "That's exactly why it needs to come out," he said. "People like you rely on fear to keep others silent. But the truth has a way of breaking through. Blake opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in his career, he felt truly cornered. He glanced at the briefcase again, his mind racing through the possibilities. He needed to think fast, to find a way to regain control before the situation spiraled further. Suddenly, Blake reached for his radio. "We're not done here," he said, his tone clipped. "But you're coming with me. I'll make sure this gets handled the right way." Carter's jaw tightened. "Handled the right way," he echoed. "By covering it up. By burying the evidence like you've done so many times before." Blake froze, the radio halfway to his mouth. The accusation hit its mark, the unspoken truth hanging heavily in the air between them. Carter pressed on, his voice rising slightly. "You can't intimidate your way out of this one, Blake. The evidence is here. It's real. And no matter what you do, it's not going away." The tension was palpable, the rain doing little to dampen the charged atmosphere. For a moment, neither man moved, their silent standoff punctuated only by the distant rumble of thunder. Then, with a frustrated growl, Blake slammed the trunk shut, the sound reverberating through the night. "Get in your car," he ordered, his voice shaky but still laced with authority. "You're following me to the station." Carter didn't move. "No," he said firmly. Blake blinked, caught off guard by the defiance. "What did you just say?" "I said no," Carter repeated. "I'm not following you anywhere. If you want to arrest me, go ahead. But we both know you don't have a case. Not with that camera recording everything." Blake's eyes darted to the dashboard camera, its red light blinking steadily. The device had been a silent witness to the entire encounter, capturing every word, every action. It was a small but undeniable shield for Carter, one that Blake couldn't ignore. The officer's face reddened with frustration. "You think you're untouchable because of that thing," he snapped. "You think a recording is going to save you." Carter took a step forward, his voice calm but resolute. "I think it's going to hold you accountable." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips. His mind raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew he was losing control, his options dwindling with every passing second. The power he had wielded so effortlessly for years now felt like a double-edged sword, threatening to cut him down at any moment. Suddenly, the crackle of static from Blake's radio broke the silence. A voice came through, distorted but urgent. "Unit 12, we have a disturbance reported on Highland Drive. Are you available to respond?" Blake grabbed the radio, his voice terse. "Negative. I'm handling something." The voice on the other end paused, then replied, "Copy that. Update when you're clear." Blake clipped the radio back to his belt, his jaw tightening. He turned to Carter, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." Carter met his gaze head-on. "Neither do you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Blake stared at Carter for a moment longer, then turned abruptly and walked back to his patrol car. Carter watched him go, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. He knew the danger wasn't over, but he also knew he couldn't back down. As Blake drove away, the red and blue lights disappearing into the distance, Carter let out a long breath. The rain continued to fall, its steady rhythm a reminder that the storm was far from over. But for the first time that night, Carter felt a flicker of hope. The truth was out, and there was no going back. He returned to his car and sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The briefcase sat on the passenger seat, its presence both comforting and ominous. Carter glanced at the camera, its red lights still blinking, and allowed himself a small, determined smile. The fight was just beginning, but he was ready. Unveiling the network. The rain finally began to ease as Carter drove away from the confrontation, the rhythmic thrum on the windshield replaced by the whisper of his tires on the wet road. His thoughts, however, were anything but quiet. Every glance at the briefcase on the passenger seat reminded him of the weight he carried, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the system that men like Blake upheld. He drove to his modest townhouse on the outskirts of the city, a quiet neighborhood that now felt ominous in its stillness. Parking his car, Carter quickly scanned the street for anything unusual. Paranoia? Maybe. But after tonight's encounter, he couldn't afford to dismiss the possibility that someone might already be watching him. Inside, Carter placed the briefcase on the dining table. He locked the door behind him and drew the blinds, shutting out the world for a moment. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the briefcase again, the contents inside gleaming under the dim kitchen light. The files were meticulously organized, each folder labeled with names, dates, and events that painted a damning picture of corruption and abuse. At the center of it all was the USB drive. Carter picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. A simple, unassuming device, yet it held enough evidence to topple not just Blake, but a network of power brokers, shady officials, and complicit law enforcement. He placed it back in the briefcase and exhaled slowly. This wasn't something he could handle alone. The journalist. Carter picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Emily Parker. She was a journalist known for her fearless reporting, a woman who had built her career on uncovering corruption and holding those in power accountable. If anyone could help him, it was her. He pressed the call button, his heart pounding as the phone rang. After a few moments, a sharp professional voice answered. "This is Emily Parker." "Emily, it's Carter Thompson," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Carter," she replied, her tone shifting to concern. "What's going on? You don't sound like yourself." "I need your help," Carter said. "It's big. Bigger than anything I've ever dealt with." Emily was silent for a moment, then said, "How big?" Carter glanced at the briefcase. "It's a network. Corruption, abuse of power, you name it. I've got evidence that ties them all together." Emily's tone became serious. "Where are you?" "I'll come to you." "No," Carter said quickly. "It's not safe. I'll come to you." Emily hesitated, then agreed. "Okay. Meet me at the downtown coffee shop, the one we used to go to after those community meetings. Midnight." "I'll be there," Carter said, ending the call. The meeting. By the time Carter arrived at the coffee shop, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the city lights. The coffee shop was nearly empty, save for a barista cleaning up behind the counter and a couple in the corner engrossed in conversation. Emily sat in a booth at the back, her laptop open in front of her. She looked up as Carter approached, her sharp blue eyes scanning his face. "You look like you've been through hell," she said, motioning for him to sit. "Feels like it," Carter replied, sliding into the booth and placing the briefcase on the table between them. Emily wasted no time. "Show me." Carter opened the briefcase, revealing the files and the USB. Emily's eyes widened as she leafed through the documents, her expression growing more serious with each passing second. "This is damning," she said finally. "These names, these dates, if this is real, it's a bombshell." "It's real," Carter said. "Blake saw it himself. That's why he let me go. He's scared." Emily nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard of her laptop as she began to document everything. "We need to verify this, cross-reference it with public records, reach out to some sources. This isn't just a story, it's an operation." As she worked, Carter felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the truth might actually come to light. The threat. The sound of the coffee shop door opening drew Carter's attention. A man in a dark suit entered, his movements deliberate as he scanned the room. Carter's instincts screamed at him that something was wrong. "Emily," he said quietly, "we might have company." Emily glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she saw the man approach. He stopped a few feet from their booth, his expression neutral but his posture radiating intimidation. "Mr. Thompson, Ms. Parker," the man said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I'm here to deliver a message." Carter tensed. "Who are you?" "That's not important," the man replied. "What is important is that you understand the consequences of your actions. The information you're handling belongs to people who don't appreciate being exposed." Emily's gaze didn't waver. "Are you threatening us?" "Not at all," the man said, his tone dripping with insincerity. "I'm simply advising you to reconsider your next steps. For your own safety." Carter stood, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Get out." The man's eyes flicked to Carter, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Think carefully, Mr. Thompson. Some truths are better left buried." With that, the man turned and walked out, leaving the coffee shop in tense silence. The escape. Emily closed her laptop and looked at Carter. "We can't stay here." Carter nodded, grabbing the briefcase. They left through the back door, stepping into a narrow alley that reeked of rain and garbage. Carter's heart raced as they made their way to Emily's car, parked a block away. As they reached the car, Emily froze. "Carter," she whispered, "look." Carter followed her gaze and saw a black SUV idling at the end of the street. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow of a cigarette in the driver's seat told him they were being watched. "They're following us," Carter said, his voice low. Emily unlocked the car, and they climbed in quickly. "Hold on," she said, starting the engine. The car roared to life, and she pulled out onto the street, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The SUV followed. Emily's hands gripped the wheel tightly as she navigated the dark streets, taking sudden turns and weaving through traffic in an attempt to lose their tail. Carter clutched the briefcase, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Finally, after a tense 20 minutes, Emily turned onto a side street and killed the lights, pulling into a narrow driveway partially hidden by overgrown bushes. They sat in silence, the only sound their labored breathing. The SUV drove past, its occupants unaware of their hiding spot. The plan. Once they were sure the danger had passed, Emily turned to Carter. "We need to go public, and we need to do it now." Carter nodded. "What do you need?" Emily pulled out her phone. "A secure location, a trusted tech team to analyze the USB, and a network to distribute the story before they can shut us down." Carter's determination hardened. "Let's do it." As the first light of dawn broke over the city, the two of them began laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most explosive revelations in recent history. But they both knew the road ahead would be perilous, the enemies they faced relentless. And yet, for the first time, the truth was within reach. The siege of truth. Dawn spilled weakly across the horizon, painting the city in muted shades of gray. The previous night's rain lingered as mist, curling around streetlights and alleyways. Carter and Emily sat in the dimly lit confines of a rented storage unit, tucked away in the industrial outskirts of the city. Inside, Emily had set up a makeshift workstation, her laptop, an external hard drive, and a small encrypted router. The USB sat on the table like an artifact of immense power, its small form belying the chaos it could unleash. "This place isn't exactly Fort Knox," Carter said, his voice low and cautious as he glanced at the narrow door and thin metal walls. "It's not supposed to be," Emily replied, her fingers dancing across her keyboard. "The idea is to be off the grid. No one's looking for us here, yet." Carter nodded, though uneased gnawed at the edges of his resolve. The confrontation with Blake and the ominous appearance of the suited man at the coffee shop had confirmed his worst fears. They were dealing with a network that wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats. Still, he wasn't about to back down. Emily leaned back in her chair, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "All right, I've started transferring the files from the USB to this external drive. I'm encrypting the copies and uploading them to a secure cloud server." "How long will that take?" Carter asked. "Hours," she admitted. "Maybe more, depending on the connection speed. But once it's done, they won't be able to bury this, even if they find us." Carter's jaw tightened. "Good, Because they're not going to stop looking. The first blow. As the minutes dragged on, Emily worked with focused intensity, cross-referencing the files against public records and gathering supplementary evidence. Carter paced the cramped unit, the tension in his chest growing with every passing second. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he hesitated before answering. "Carter," a familiar voice said. It was Malcolm, an old friend and local activist who had often marched alongside Carter in protests against police brutality. "I heard about what happened last night. Are you okay?" Carter exhaled deeply, relieved to hear a friendly voice. "I'm holding up, Malcolm, but it's bigger than you think." "You mean the run-in with Blake?" Malcolm asked, his voice lowering. "I heard he let you go, but not before making a scene." "It wasn't just a scene," Carter said, glancing at Emily. "I got evidence, real evidence, against him and others. It's dangerous, but it needs to come out." There was a pause. Then Malcolm said, "Carter, you know they're not going to let that happen without a fight." "I know," Carter replied. "That's why I need your help." "Say the word, and I'll rally the community," Malcolm said. "We'll make enough noise to keep them from silencing you." Carter smiled faintly. "Thanks, Malcolm. I'll let you know when the time comes." As he ended the call, Emily looked up. "That was smart. If we're exposed, having public support might be the only thing keeping us alive." The system strikes back. 2 hours later, as Emily continued her work, Carter's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated but answered. "Mr. Thompson," a voice said, cold and clipped. "This is Captain Reynolds with the Metropolitan Police Department. We need you to come in for questioning regarding an incident involving Officer Blake." Carter's grip on the phone tightened. "Questioning? About what?" "We've received a complaint from Officer Blake about your behavior during a traffic stop," Reynolds said. "He alleges you were uncooperative and attempted to obstruct a lawful investigation." "That's a lie," Carter said, his voice rising. "Blake was the one who overstepped. He illegally searched my car and threatened me." "I'm not here to debate the details, Mr. Thompson," Reynolds replied. "But I'd strongly advise you to come in voluntarily. Refusing to cooperate will only make things worse for you." Carter hung up, his heart pounding. He turned to Emily, who was already watching him with concern. "They're trying to flip the narrative," he said. "Blake's accusing me of obstruction." "Classic tactic," Emily said, her voice laced with disdain. "If they can paint you as the aggressor, they'll undermine your credibility before the evidence ever sees the light of day." Carter clenched his fists. "They're trying to scare me into silence." "And we can't let them," Emily said firmly. She tapped her keyboard. "We need to release something now. Enough to show we're serious, but not everything. If they know the evidence is already out there, it'll make them think twice about coming after us." The first leak. Emily selected a few key documents from the USB, redacting sensitive names to protect innocent parties, while leaving enough information to expose Blake's actions. She uploaded them to an encrypted whistleblower platform and drafted an anonymous statement. "To the people of this city, this is the beginning of the truth. The attached files reveal the actions of Officer Gerald Blake and his involvement in a larger network of corruption and abuse. We have more evidence that will be released in due time. To those who have suffered in silence, know that you are not alone. To those in power, know that your time is running out. The truth is coming." The files went live within minutes, the platform's automated systems ensuring they were disseminated to journalists, activists, and community leaders. Emily leaned back in her chair, her expression grim but resolute. "There," she said. "Now they know we're not bluffing." Carter nodded, though the weight of what they had just done settled heavily on his shoulders. "We've lit the match," he said. "Now we see how fast the fire spreads." Retaliation. The response was swift. Within hours, the leaked documents had gone viral, sparking outrage on social media and drawing attention from major news outlets. But the backlash from the system was equally fierce. Carter's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from unknown numbers, some leaving voicemails laced with veiled threats. A news van parked outside his townhouse, reporters clamoring for a statement. Meanwhile, Blake appeared on a local news broadcast, painting himself as a victim of a smear campaign. "I've always done my job with integrity," Blake said, his face a mask of righteous indignation. These accusations are baseless, meant to discredit law enforcement and undermine public trust. Carter watched the broadcast from the storage unit, his fists clenched. "He's doubling down," he said, pretending to be the good guy. "Of course he is," Emily said. "He's banking on the system protecting him. But that's why we keep going. The more they push, the more we expose." The next step. As the hours turned into days, the tension only grew. Emily and Carter relocated twice, their paranoia fueled by sightings of unmarked cars and the relentless hum of helicopters overhead. But they pressed on, gathering allies and preparing their next move. The files on the USB revealed connections far beyond Blake, names of politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials who had profited from the corruption. Emily worked tirelessly to verify the information, while Carter reached out to trusted activists and journalists, building a network of support. Finally, one night, as they sat in yet another safe house, Emily looked up from her laptop. "It's ready," she said. "What is?" Carter asked. "The full story," she replied. "Everything. We release it all at once, documents, video evidence, and a recorded statement from you. It'll be undeniable." Carter hesitated, the enormity of the decision weighing on him. But then he thought of Blake's smirk, the suited man's threats, and the countless lives ruined by their actions. "Let's do it," he said. Emily nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The truth was ready to come out, and this time there would be no going back. The boiling point. The night air carried a biting chill as Carter and Emily sat in their newest safe house, a sparsely furnished basement apartment loaned to them by a local activist. The walls were bare, the windows covered with blackout curtains, and the only sounds were the soft hum of Emily's laptop and the occasional distant wail of sirens. The tension was suffocating. Emily's fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard as she finalized their next move. The files on the USB had been meticulously reviewed, cross-referenced, and compiled into an airtight exposé. Each document was paired with irrefutable evidence, video recordings, timestamps, and corroborating witness testimonies. The story had evolved into something far larger than Carter had ever anticipated. "Everything's queued up," Emily said, breaking the heavy silence. "We hit publish, and this goes out to every major news outlet, whistleblower platform, and activist network in the country." Carter nodded, though his stomach churned with a mix of anticipation and dread. "What happens next?" Emily leaned back, her expression grim. "The system will fight back harder than ever. We've already seen the threats, the smear campaigns, the intimidation. This will escalate, but the more people know, the harder it'll be for them to silence us." Carter's mind drifted to the community he had fought so hard to protect. He thought of the faces of those who had marched beside him, the voices of those who had cried out for justice. "We have to do this," he said, his voice firm. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's been silenced." Emily's gaze softened. "You're braver than you realize, Carter." Before they could say more, the sound of tires screeching outside jolted them both. Emily snapped her laptop shut, and Carter rushed to the window, carefully parting the curtain just enough to see. A black SUV idled at the curb, its headlights piercing the darkness. Two men in dark suits stepped out, their movements deliberate and purposeful. Carter's pulse quickened. "They found us," he whispered. "The siege begins." Emily grabbed her laptop and began packing up their materials. "We need to move. Now." Carter nodded, his instincts screaming at him to run. But as he turned toward the back door, a loud knock echoed through the apartment, freezing them both in their tracks. Carter Thompson. A deep voice called. Emily Parker. We know you're in there. Open the door. Carter glanced at Emily, who shook her head. If we open that door, we're done, she said. They'll seize everything. The knock came again, harder this time. Open the door, or we'll come in. Emily motioned toward the back exit. We'll slip out the alley. I have a burner car parked 2 blocks away. If we can make it there, we can regroup. Carter hesitated, his eyes darting to the briefcase on the table. It contained the hard copies of the evidence, the physical manifestation of everything they were risking their lives for. We can't leave this behind. Emily grabbed the briefcase, her grip firm. We won't. Now move. The escape. As the men outside began forcing the lock, Carter and Emily slipped out the back door into the narrow alley. The cold air hit them like a slap, and the dim streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the wet pavement. They moved quickly but cautiously, keeping to the edges of the alley to avoid detection. Behind them, they heard the splintering of wood as the front door gave way. The men had broken in. Keep moving, Emily urged, her voice low but urgent. They rounded a corner, their breaths visible in the frigid night air. Just ahead, Emily's car came into view, a nondescript sedan parked beneath a flickering streetlight. But before they could reach it, the unmistakable roar of an engine stopped them in their tracks. The black SUV had circled the block and was now blocking their path. The doors of the SUV swung open, and 2 more men stepped out, each armed and wearing the grim expressions of professionals. Carter's heart raced as he realized the alley was now effectively sealed off. We're not here to hurt you, one of the men called out, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just hand over the evidence, and this all goes away. Emily tightened her grip on the briefcase, her eyes darting for an escape route. Not a chance, she muttered. Carter's mind raced. They couldn't fight these men, not physically. But the briefcase wasn't their only weapon. Emily, he said, an idea forming. Do it now. Emily hesitated for a split second before understanding. She opened her laptop, her hands moving quickly as she accessed their pre-prepared upload. The men, realizing what she was doing, advanced. Stop her, one of them shouted. Carter stepped forward, positioning himself between Emily and the approaching men. His voice rang out, steady and defiant. You're too late. Once she hits that button, the whole world will know. The men faltered, their advance slowing. For the first time, Carter saw doubt flicker in their eyes. These weren't men who thrived on exposure. They operated in the shadows, and the threat of light was their greatest weakness. Emily's voice broke through the tense silence. Done. The release, back in the storage unit, the upload reached its conclusion. Servers across the country lit up as the files spread like wildfire, triggering automated alerts to journalists, activists, and whistleblower networks. Social media exploded as the story went live. The hashtag exposed the system, trending within minutes. The evidence was damning. Documents tying Blake to a network of corrupt officials, videos of unlawful arrests and cover-ups, financial records tracing bribes and kickbacks. Names were named, dates were documented, and the truth was laid bare for the world to see. The reckoning. As the files spread, the men in the alley hesitated. Their radios crackled with frantic voices, likely relaying the news. One of them cursed under his breath, and the SUV's driver slammed the door shut, signaling a retreat. Let's go, the leader barked, his tone sharp with frustration. Carter and Emily watched as the men climbed back into the SUV and sped off into the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air was still. We did it, Emily said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Carter nodded, though his body still trembled with adrenaline. It's out there. They can't take it back. The fallout. The following days were a whirlwind. News outlets ran the story nonstop, their headlines blaring the words, "Corruption uncovered. A network exposed." Protests erupted across the city, with crowds demanding accountability and justice. Blake was suspended pending investigation, and several high-ranking officials named in the files resigned under mounting pressure. Carter became an unlikely hero, his name synonymous with courage and resilience. But he refused to take full credit, always pointing to the community that had rallied behind him and the journalists who had amplified the truth. Emily, meanwhile, continued her work, ensuring the story's momentum didn't wane. "This is just the beginning," she told Carter during one of their rare quiet moments. "The system doesn't crumble overnight, but we've struck a blow they won't recover from." Carter nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "Then let's keep going." The fallout and the reckoning. The weeks following the release of the exposé were a blur of chaos and transformation. The city seemed to pulse with a new energy, equal parts fury and hope. Crowds filled the streets day and night, their chants echoing through the skyline like a heartbeat for justice. Signs bearing slogans like "End Corruption Now" and "Justice for All" waved in unison as voices demanded accountability for the atrocities unearthed in the files Carter and Emily had released. But for Carter, the reckoning came at a price. The storm within. Carter sat in the small apartment he had temporarily called home, watching the news on an old flickering TV. The images on the screen were a direct result of his actions. Gerald Blake being led into a courtroom, his head held high but his arrogance visibly chipped away. Reporters shouted questions at him, their microphones thrust like weapons. "Officer Blake, do you have any comment on the allegations? Were you aware of the corruption ring you were part of? Do you plan to cooperate with investigators?" Blake ignored them, his face a mask of cold defiance. But Carter saw the cracks in his composure. He knew that behind the facade, Blake was unraveling. Emily entered the room, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She placed one in front of Carter and sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "He's fighting like hell to save himself," she said, nodding at the screen. "But it won't work. Not this time." Carter took a sip of his coffee, the warmth grounding him for a moment. "He's not the only one," he said quietly. "The system that protected him, that empowered him, it's still standing." "For now," Emily replied. "But the cracks are showing. That's where we focus." Carter nodded, though the weight of their actions pressed heavily on his chest. The truth was out, but so were the consequences. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was being scrutinized by those who had lost control of their narrative. Retaliation in the shadows. The retaliation came subtly at first. Anonymous calls flooded Carter's phone, the voices on the other end whispering threats laced with malice. Emails appeared in Emily's inbox, warning her to stay in her lane or face the consequences. Carter's bank account was suddenly frozen, a bureaucratic error that left him unable to access his funds for days. Then, one night, it escalated. Carter returned to the apartment to find the front door ajar. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning for any signs of an intruder. The place had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. "Emily," he called, panic rising in his chest. "I'm here." Her voice came from the bedroom. She emerged moments later, holding her laptop to her chest. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with anger. "They didn't get it. I had everything backed up." Carter exhaled shakily. "They're trying to scare us." "They're trying to silence us," Emily corrected. She placed the laptop on the table and began typing furiously. "We need to report this, and we need to let them know we're not backing down." But as she worked, Carter's mind wandered to the countless others who had been silenced by these same tactics. How many voices had been snuffed out before they had a chance to be heard? The public rally. The next day, Carter and Emily attended a public rally in the heart of the city. Thousands had gathered, their collective energy electrifying the air. Malcolm stood at the podium, his booming voice rallying the crowd. "This city has been controlled by fear for too long," he shouted, his words met with thunderous applause. But today, we stand together to say no more." Carter watched from the sidelines, his hood pulled low to avoid drawing attention. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Emily, her expression soft but resolute. "They need to see you," she said. "You're the reason we're here." Carter hesitated but then stepped forward, the crowd parting as Malcolm motioned him to the stage. As he climbed the steps, a hush fell over the gathering. Thousands of eyes turned to him, their gazes filled with expectation and hope. He took the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm just a man who got tired of staying silent." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Carter held up his hand for quiet. "This isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about standing up to a system that thrives on fear and silence. And it's about the people who didn't make it here today because their voices were stolen from them." Tears stung his eyes as he looked out over the sea of faces. "We've started something powerful, but it's not over. They will fight us every step of the way. But if we stand together, they can't win." The roar of the crowd was deafening, their chants of justice for all echoing through the city streets. Carter felt a surge of hope. The system wasn't invincible. It could be broken. A house of cards. The dominoes began to fall faster than anyone expected. The release of the files triggered a wave of investigations that spread like wildfire. Politicians were forced to resign. Business leaders were exposed for their shady dealings, and law enforcement agencies faced a reckoning that sent shockwaves through the country. Blake, once untouchable, found himself at the center of it all. With his name plastered across every headline and his former allies abandoning him, he had no choice but to cooperate. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he began naming names, pulling others into the maelstrom of accountability. The system that had protected him for so long was devouring itself. A new beginning. Months later, Carter stood in the same courthouse where Blake had once walked with arrogance. But this time, it was different. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and citizens, eager to witness the conclusion of the trial that had come to define a movement. Blake sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor replaced by a hollowed-out shell of a man. As the judge read the verdict, guilty on all counts, a collective cheer erupted outside. Carter stepped into the sunlight, the weight on his chest finally lifting. Emily joined him, her expression one of quiet triumph. "We did it," she said. Carter nodded. "We started it," he corrected. "Now it's up to the people to keep it going." As they walked away, the chants of the crowd echoed behind them. For the first time in years, Carter felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The truth had won its first battle, and the system would never be the same. The story concludes with hope and determination, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for justice. Let me know if you'd like to refine or expand any part further.